Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this convocation on durable trades. My name is Dr. Matthew Brummett. I'm an English professor here, for those of you who don't know me. And I just wanted to introduce briefly Mr. Rory Groves, our speaker today. He's the author of this book called Durable Trades, Family-Centered Economies That Have Stood the Test of Time. I think I actually first heard about you from, interestingly enough, a UMary professor who's not somebody that's around campus much. His name's Dr. Ryan Hanning. He writes sometimes for this online journal, Hearth and Field, and he reviewed your book for that. I think that's the first time I saw your name. As you'll see later on, he has a family website, the Grovestead, and then Gather and Grow Ministries is something they've started recently. So I then found my way onto his family farm's website and got a copy of this book, which lists 61 trades that have been around for at least a few hundred years, and many of these basically throughout human history. And the reason I wanted him to come to talk to the students in particular here, obviously we're happy to have faculty and staff here as well, but the students, I wanted you all to know, you don't have to spend the rest of your life in a cubicle if you don't want to, right? There are other things you can do, that it's not office work. Similarly, you wouldn't have to be in a factory your whole life. You could do other things. So these are particularly family-oriented sorts of careers or jobs you might choose to take up. No matter what your degree may be, you could then go on and work on a farm or run a painting business. Or he has a number of different kinds of businesses here in the book. You'll have a few copies of his book available for sale if you're interested. We're not going to have like a formal booth or something, but if you want to talk to him one-on-one after the convocation, you can do so. And then if you find this idea interesting, he'll have some copies of his book. I also wanted to mention the author of the foreword to this book, Alan Carlson. We've invited to come to campus next semester in February 24th. He's someone who's written extensively on family economy and living with your family, homesteading kinds of things, homeschooling, these sorts of things, more family-centered ways of living. And so he'll be talking actually about North Dakotan bishops and the Catholic land movement in the sort of middle of the last century. That's in February, but he's someone that Rory knows, and so this connection there. And please now help me in joining Mr. Rory Groves, welcoming him, please.
Good morning. Does everyone hear me okay? Good, thumbs up. I'm very glad to be here. And appreciate you taking, the next 30, 40 minutes with me, hearing what I have to say. Thank you to Dr. Brummett for inviting me out here. They've been very hospitable to us, staying with their family while I'm here, and we've had an ongoing conversation about a lot of the themes in my book, which has been kind of consistent. I guess I was surprised at the amount of response that I got from writing this book, because mainly when I wrote it, I didn't know if there was anybody else out there that kind of was having the same sense and feeling about life and work and vocation and family that I was having. I'm 45, I turned 45 this year, so I've been working in the same field of high technology for 25 plus years, which I'll get into. But anyways, this has been kind of a really neat experience. I came in from Minnesota, and by the way, it's 1 degree this morning with a negative 15-degree wind chill, so you really didn't have to go through all that trouble to help me feel welcome here. I would have preferred a little bit of a warmer greeting, but anyways, you make it a warm greeting by being friendly with me. We spent some time this morning with some classmates. Who was in Dr. Brummett's class this morning that's here? Okay, great. A few of you here. Hi, great. Good to see you again. And so, it's been good. So the goal of what I want to talk to you about today is meaningful work. And this is a topic that's become more and more prevalent, as we'll get into. But you guys, right now, at this age, in these years of your life, and frankly, Dr. Brummett and Mrs. Roofs, these are all topics that anyone at any age is considering and constantly contemplating, but especially at your age, because of the decisions you're making right now on your career and vocation, they will impact you for the rest of your life. And so just take a moment to step outside the box with me a little bit, and let's let's go into some of these thoughts about meaningful work. I wanted to just share briefly, this is my family. That's my wife, Becca. I have 6 children. Oldest to youngest, Ivor, is 12, and then there's Elsie, Hattie, Alden, Elias, and in the upper right corner there is my youngest son, Abel, who was just born about 3 months ago. We live on a farm in southern Minnesota, and that's me harvesting potatoes with some of the older kids, and barely able to lift the box because it's so heavy. We moved onto that farm about 10 years ago. And one of the things that I recognized, I've been working in the tech field for my entire career, and I wrote my first computer program when I was probably 6 years old. I don't remember exactly, but as long as I can remember, I was a kid that was always into computers, always into video games, always into wanting to be in a field. Being a computer programmer was always what I had in mind. And it was kind of an odd way how we ended up on a farm, but basically the short story is someone gave us a tomato plant while we were living in another town in an apartment, and I put this tomato plant, it's kind of an odd gift to get from somebody. It's something that you gotta, here's a gift, now you go take care of this gift. Thanks a lot. And so we threw it out on the balcony, and we watered it. And I kind of watched over the months as this tomato plant would grow and have these little yellow flowers, and they'd turn into green little tiny balls. It was actually a cherry tomato plant, which is really small tomatoes, and then they'd turn red, and then I'd pick them off the vine and eat them, and they're almost like candy. They're so good tasting. I was like, what is this? This isn't a tomato that I've ever tasted before. I was like, well, it was an organically grown tomato, and that kind of was the beginning of a yarn that we tugged on until we ended up moving back to a house in South Minneapolis, and I started digging up all of my lawn to plant bigger gardens because, of course, there's only so much room on a balcony. And then that actually, a couple years later, we moved to a 10-acre hobby farm in southern Minnesota. And that was 10 years ago now. So we just continued to expand on this, I guess you would call it working the land, but again, it was more of a hobby or kind of a curiosity of mine. It wasn't really like, what I'm going to do is become a full-time tomato farmer. It wasn't anything like that. It just was something that we enjoyed. So I plan to continue in my software programming this whole time, and I didn't have any intention to quit. This is after moving to a farm. I worked remotely. I had a software business. But one of the contrasts that I experienced was that there was so much tangibility on a farm, in the farm. I have a picture there of the computer code next to me working the dirt with my kids. We were actually planting, I think we were planting corn and squash that day. But there was just this contrast. So I would be out in the farm, we'd be working together as a family, we're outside, we're digging in the dirt, we're doing things that are real tangible, that produce tangible things. That feed us literally from the ground. And then I would leave my, hobby to go to my real job, my quote unquote real job, which is sitting and staring at a computer screen all day. And as I would start to leave the family to do these things, I started to just wonder, this real job actually feels more artificial than what I was just doing with my family. And is there possibly a way that we could, combine a way to earn a living and still be with my family and still be closer to the land and doing tangible things? Because, if you work in the computer sciences, you know how ethereal everything is, how abstracted, how, like that screen of computer code, nobody knows what that means. So that was just something that over the years started to weigh on me. Also, there was the reality that everything I did as a computer programmer went obsolete, usually within a couple of years, if not months. And, I had spent years building up a computer software business and would find these software programs that I would maybe spend years building would become obsolete in about 18 months. It's not that there was no market for it, it's just that it just changed so rapidly. And there was a subject that I interviewed for my book. His name's John Kaczynski, and Yeah, something like that. Anyway, he talked about remodeling a cabin. He had acquired a property up in northern Wisconsin, and he was remodeling a cabin. He was a fellow software coder like myself, and he said he was tearing off the walls, and when he got down to the studs, he found a signature in the walls, which would have been of the guy who built the cabin originally, like a long time ago. And he said, the thought went through my head that this guy, who probably had a grade school education, his work is still standing more than 100 years later. And me, so elegant and full of myself, my line of code is old and gray by the time it hits the hard drive. And John actually ended up leaving his computer job in the dust, or in the sawdust, as I say, and he became a sawyer. I mean, he actually does this now. He mills logs into lumber. But he also makes fine furniture out of that. And in some cases, he'll take down trees on people's property where they're building a home. He'll take down trees that might be in the site, the building site, take them down, mill them up, and bring back furniture to furnish that home that was built right on that site. So he does some very fascinating work. And I could relate to what John was saying because as a computer scientist, I had watched my own job skills continually going obsolete. Even or especially after working decades in that industry. And so, after about 20 years of this, I just started to wonder if there's another way. In the modern economy, if you're not continuously retraining, you're just constantly facing this obsolescence. So was there another way? It turns out that yes, there are some professions where the work never goes obsolete. Someone once said that there can be a post-industrial culture. Well, yeah, here's some trades. There can be a post-industrial culture, a post-modern culture, even a post-Christian culture, but there will never be a post-agriculture. No matter how high a society... Good. No matter how high-tech a society gets, people will always need to eat. They will always need clothing and shelter, which brings me to my topic today, which is meaningful work. Have any of you heard of the term the Great Resignation? Yeah, there's a stock ticker out there in that entryway, and so what we are going through right now, even though you don't notice it, we're going through a revolution in work. What happened over the last year is 48 million people quit their jobs voluntarily. A full 1/3 of the employed workforce up and quit. They weren't fired; they quit. And it's what economists have dubbed the Great Resignation. And it's completely unprecedented since they've been keeping records. So management consultants are scrambling now to try to explain this because it doesn't fit in with any business theories of why people during a recession and a pandemic would up and quit their jobs. And CEOs are trying to find workers. Part of the shortages that we're experiencing is because people just aren't working. There aren't enough people in the jobs to produce the things that we need. They've tried increasing salaries or coming up with new incentives like flexible work at home arrangements, but it's not working. Everyone from hotel housekeepers to C-level executives are quitting their jobs to seek more fulfilling work. Some of them have ended up on farms. Others just want more time with their families. So keep this in mind at the beginning of your careers. Men and women right now who have spent their entire lives climbing the corporate ladder and arriving at the top of it, they're finding out that there's nothing there, that the fulfillment was not waiting for them in the corner office, so to speak. About 1.6 million working mothers left the labor force during the pandemic, writes one analyst. Some of them are now homeschooling. Another study said that the pandemic changed the way people work and how they view work. Many are reflecting on what a quality job feels like, and nearly half are willing to quit to find one. I don't actually think it's that complicated what's going on. It's not that people don't want to work. It's that they want their work to mean something, and they want to perform it with people who mean something to them. The practice of families working together to provide the things they need is not an antiquated notion belonging to the dustbin of history. It is how we were originally designed to live. The practice is found in the first chapters of Genesis and still holds force today. The family economy is God's original plan for productive households, resilient communities, stable societies, and stewardship of the earth. So by the way, these are pictures of that other families have sent to us of their family-based businesses, or family economies, as I describe it in the book. Many of these families have recently quit their jobs to start something that's home-based, or they're in the process of migrating to that. Our word economy is deriving from the Greek words oikonomia. Does anyone know what that means? Oikonomia. We got some English language professors here in the room, so I know this. Yes?
Household law.
Household law, thank you. C.R. Wiley says, in the beginning, it was all in the house, the whole economy. You know, we think of economy as like the global economy, right? What's going on all around the world. Well, economy was a household term originally. That's because all productivity emanated from the home, from the house. It was within the context of the home economy, not the factory, that family members found meaning and fulfillment as they worked together towards a common purpose. They also found comfort and care, apprenticed and mentored each other, and transmitted faith, culture, and values on to the next generation. But since the rise of the factory system about 200 years ago, work has increasingly driven a wedge between family members, dividing husband from wife, father from son, mother from daughter, and family from home. Historian Alan C. Carlson says, the most socially disruptive effect of the Industrial Revolution was the way it severed the place where adults work from the place where adults live. Most of our current family questions, from loud disputes over gender roles to childcare to low fertility, derive from this great disruption. As a result, families today have abandoned nearly all of the functions traditionally practiced at home, like work, education, apprenticeship, childcare, elder care. And often cooking, cleaning, and brewing a cup of coffee have been parceled out to corporations, institutions, and bureaucrats. Even our entertainment is age-oriented and consumed apart more often than together. Historians record that prior to the Industrial Revolution, every household was, quote, a self-producing and self-sustaining community. Today, with so many domestic functions lost, the typical American household more closely resembles a mere overnight parking place. In his book, Family Life, Kevin Swanson likens the family economy to an axe and handle. He says, an axe head by itself is of little use to take down trees, but place an axe head on an axe handle, and the capability for useful work has increased 100-fold. This demonstrates the basic elements of the family economy is designed by God. He continues, the basic economic unit is not an individual, and it is not a corporation or the government. According to the creation mandate and 5,900 years of historical practice, the basic economic unit is the family. So, the family economy encompasses more than a family business and entrepreneurship, although that's an essential part of it. It also integrates education, discipleship, worship, ministry, and recreation. It's the melding together of individual aspirations into a common purpose. In other words, it's not what the husband is particularly talented at, or the wife is particularly talented at, or the children's gifts or propensities or interests. It's what all of those things together combine to do what no other family could do apart. More importantly, it has been the context in which parents have passed on their faith and values to their children for thousands of years. So for me, there was this instability of the high-tech field that I was operating in, my high-tech vocation. There was the desire to work together as a family rather than be separated for the majority of our lives. And as parents, there was the desire to pass on our faith to our children, by far the most important thing we could do with our lives. In other words, money was not the motivator. We wanted to build a life that money could not buy. But how? Another English literature or English language note here. I think it's interesting that our word for career comes from the French word carrière, if I pronounce that right, meaning race course. You might think of a career like a racetrack. And most of you will dedicate a significant portion of your life running along this track, maybe running in circles around this track. Have any of you ever heard of this man, Eric Liddell? It says here, many of us are missing something in life because we are after the second best. He was an Olympic athlete in the 20s, 1920s, not the 20s, so 100 years ago. And he was known for holding to his deeply held convictions. He shocked the world when he refused to run his scheduled race, in which he was expected to win gold medal, because it was on a Sunday, the Lord's Day, and he didn't run on the Sabbath. There's a movie about him called Chariots of Fire, which is an excellent movie. I'd recommend it if you haven't seen it. But he actually went on to run a different race on a different day, and he won gold in that race and became the most celebrated athlete in Scotland. But after that, he gave up any further Olympic pursuit in order to become a missionary to China with his family. When he was asked about this perplexing decision, he said this, "Since I have been a young lad, I've had my eyes on a different prize. You see, each one of us is in a greater race than any I have run in Paris. And this race ends when God gives out the medals." So again, right now, you are making decisions about your racetrack. These decisions are going to follow you the rest of your lives. What is the prize you are running for? In other words, what sort of future do you want your life to have? What do you want it to look like? Is it about becoming successful? Or famous, or wealthy, or is it filled with family, with friendships, with work that is meaningful and tangible, rewards that the modern economy doesn't always place a high value on, but are nonetheless necessary and rewarding and fulfilling? I once met with an entrepreneur several years ago. We were discussing the possibility of working together. He was very successful, and he had sold his previous company, and so he knew the ins and outs of the marketplace, and it was a good opportunity for me, and I would possibly stand to make a lot of money. I let him know, though, early on that my family was always the priority, and I couldn't commit to a business plan that would rearrange those priorities. And I remember this conversation very distinctly. We were having lunch, and he looked at me across the table with a sober expression on his face, and he said, "I've been a successful CEO and made millions of dollars, but I lost my family." And then he told me not to follow his example and to continue prioritizing my family. And one of the things that you need to realize as you set out in the workforce, whatever direction you're going to go, is that there is an immense amount of pressure on you, especially in your earlier years, to prioritize your work ahead of your family or ahead of your relationships. Often, by the time people recognize that this is not a fully rewarding direction, it's too late. The kids have grown, they're estranged, there are breakdowns in the family and in those relationships. So you have to put on some determination early in life. This man, he would say that he had won the prize, but that the prize was not worth having. And he would have given anything to go back and run his race differently. So, as I'm saying, it's essential early in life to determine whether the prize you are running for is worth having and if the track you are racing on will get you there. You don't want to spend the rest of your life racing for a prize only to discover it's not what you wanted in the end. So these kinds of experiences, along with the questions I was referring to earlier, this is what inspired our family to start looking for another way, to begin moving towards a more self-sufficient life, one in which we could cooperate with each other. We started doing things like raising chickens and keeping bees and milking goats, and my wife makes goat milk soap, and we harvest wild tea leaves, from our property, and we do all kinds of little things like that. The goal, again, is not the financial success of it, although there are some ways to make an income doing these. That's not the primary goal. The primary goal is self-sufficiency and to be together as we work. We started hosting workshops, and writing to share what we were learning with others. We started publishing a family newsletter. That's the kids there folding up our newsletter that we send out. And by the way, I have copies if anyone's interested. I brought a few copies along, but we do a family newsletter that reflects on our experiences of farming and trying to make a go of it. Not only have these experiences brought us together as a family, they've supported us during times of recent upheaval. So during the worker shortages following the pandemic and so forth, in the supply chain woes, we discovered that we were not really affected by a lot of this stuff because we had built our own supply chain. You know, we didn't have to go to the supermarket for as many things. We had freezers stocked with food. We had chickens laying eggs. We had food growing in our garden. There's just a side benefit of the fact that we were taking more responsibility for our needs. And we discovered we were not alone. Since the publication of Durable Trades, we've received hundreds of letters from families who are reconsidering the priorities they place on work and family, and many who are, as I showed you earlier, beginning a new family economy of their own. One of the aspects that I would highlight is when you think about historical trades, and I don't go into too much of the details about why the trades are in my book, but there's a reason. They're historically stable and they're family-centered. And you can get the book if you're interested in learning more about that. But one of the things about historical trades is that they're probably always going to be around. If you highly specialize in some profession, let's say you want to become a search engine optimizer, you know, and help people rank their websites highly. That's a very in-demand profession at the moment. You can make a lot of money doing that. But Google could change an algorithm overnight and essentially wipe out the entire industry. And that has been the nature of innovation for the last, 150 years. These innovations have come along and they've wiped out professions that are overly specialized. So there's some value in getting some general skill sets. Like, let's say you don't want to become a full-time home builder, but you could maybe work with a contractor in your summer months to help pay for college. You could learn a skill, in how to do construction or electrical or plumbing. And you know what? You think that skill will come in handy, Matthew? You'll use that skill yourself the rest of your life. And actually, you might discover that you like it, and you probably make more money at it if you wanted to go that direction than you would in an office job. Hard to say that, but it's true. The other thing about trades is that most families throughout history, they practiced multiple overlapping trades. In other words, they weren't just carpenters, but they were also furniture makers, and they also farmed, and they also dairied, and they maybe grew some medicinal herbs. I don't know, but you'd see families would typically practice 4, 5, or 6 things. They maybe had some lodging, and they'd take in travelers for pay. We have Airbnb today. That's a holdover from innkeeper, which is a durable trade that goes back thousands of years. And so there were ways in which families diversified rather than specializing. And that can be another way to approach it. You can continue on with whatever your focus is, if you're going to become professors, or you're going to become working in offices, or you're going to work in schools, or in the computer sciences like I did. But you can also have these other side businesses going on, and you can do them with your family. And that's a great way to diversify your income, and also if something should happen to your office job, if you should be unfortunately caught up in a recession, you would have this kind of very legitimate skill to fall back on. So Alan Carlson, again, he writes this: in the midst of pandemic, economic crisis, violence, and the apparent breakdown of law and order, I turn again to some of the most basic questions. Why are we here? What is our purpose? How does God want us to live our lives? The answer, according to Carlson, is inextricably linked to our original design. Were we created merely to maximize productive output, to be efficient cogs in a machine? Or were we created to live, work, produce, and provide together with family and community as the mission, rather than the bottom line? If we were created to labor together, then job promotions and salary increases will never satisfy our thirst for meaning. Neither will flexible working arrangements or challenging work. Meaning and fulfillment derive from connection with our Creator, and with those he has joined together. And we can recover what was lost if we prioritize family ahead of modest gains in efficiency, if we reclaim time together rather than paychecks apart. Thank you. So, yeah, I think we have a few minutes here. We can take some Q&A.
So we are recording this convocation, so if you have a question, you'll talk into the mic. But we've got lots of time for questions. If you have questions about particular trades that are in his book, or whatever the questions may be about meaningful work, you can ask those. Who has a question? Right here.
First off, thank you for coming and speaking at University of Mary. I really appreciate you. I think this is a really important topic that isn't getting enough attention. But one of the questions I was wondering is, can you give some more examples of what this holistic labor could look like, especially for families that have two working parents where, you know, they're not home till like 4 o'clock and they only have very precious hours when they're at home, of how they can have this holistic labor, but then also proper leisure?
Sure, good. So question is how can families that are already divided for the better part of their day have more holistic labor? And so the idea and the actual goal is to counter the trend entirely, is to seek a way to actually, how can we eventually, maybe not overnight, but how can we eventually work together in a common profession where it's a family profession, not just mom's profession and dad's profession. So that might start out differently for different families because economically, not everyone's in a position to just go down to a single income. So what I recommend to families is that they would do something. Start something, no matter how small it is. Evenings, weekends, just do something that's home-based. And then watch and see if God would bless that thing. If God's intention is for families to work together, if that's how he designed humans to actually live, then you should see a flourishing happen in the home-based, family-based economy that would eventually eclipse what you could do separately. Now, it might not be, in our case, I basically have walked away from a much higher salary than we could make if I were to leave my family. To me, that's part of the compensation, is that I would much rather have a $40,000 a year salary than a $400,000 a year salary, which conceivably I could command in the open marketplace for computer science technology. To me, it's no question in my mind. There's compensation with the family being together, and we can figure out a way to make it work. So while the direction is bringing the family together as one, there are a lot of things you could do along the way, side hustles, gig economy. There's a lot of different ways and options out there. And then I didn't really get into like naming off the actual trades and so forth, but like one that I mentioned, which is fashionable right now, is the Airbnb. A lot of people putting cabins, putting campers on land that they own. I have a friend of mine who moved his family, same situation, husband and wife both working separate jobs separately. They moved onto a 20-acre farm that had 2 houses on it, and started with the intention of fixing up the second house and renting it out as a Airbnb, a lodging, to help begin their family economy. He said within 3 months of renting that house out, the property was paying for itself. So their entire foray into this experiment was blessed incredibly. And now his wife is actually homeschooling the kids. This is something that they've felt that is the right direction for them. And they are, continuing to build upon. Now, he still does consulting work outside the home, and there's different things, but the goal is to continue building their farm-based and their family-based economy. So there are lots of examples like this.
Can you say a few examples of trades that are not on a farm? Because one of the interesting things about the book was, in-town businesses that can still be family-oriented even today.
Well, I was sharing with someone bakery goes way back. One of the surefire ways I've seen in other small, especially in Anabaptist communities, they'll open a bakery in a town that's adjacent to where the community lives. And they very consistently can not only float the business, but they provide jobs for people within the larger community, not just their own family. I've seen this over and over again. I would say anyone going into the repair trades would be excellent direction right now. The direction we're going with the economy the way it is, and there's uncertainty and there's inflation and it's hard to find things. People need to repair and make last longer the things they already have. So any kind of mechanical vocations, there's woodworking is one that I would recommend because it's in the same vein of construction, but you can actually base it at home. You can. There was a guy that I met just a month ago. I think this was in at the beginning of October. He showed me his wood shop that was about 100 paces from his house. A simple bare floor, dirt floor, with machines. He had electricity and everything, but he just had a very simple woodworking shed. And he has employed full time for the last 11 years making walking sticks and spoons, wooden spoons. That's it. He's a full-time woodworker. And it's not like you can't just do that overnight, but if you can work towards a direction where the craftsmanship is appreciated to the point where you can support a family. He probably had 5 kids or 6 kids, I'm not sure. And so there's lots of opportunities in the craft environment that doesn't have to be on huge acreages of land. You could do them very simply. Any other that you can think of, Matthew, that come to mind?
I was thinking even like pharmacists. You have an example of a pharmacist in Northfield, I think, who will bring their kids to the pharmacy and help out around the place.
Pharmacists. They have an in-town shop. Of course, there's merchants, midwives. If you're familiar, that's a pretty up-and-coming, resurging profession, I should say. It's a very historical profession, but midwives actually do very well financially. They can scale up and scale down the business based on their family needs. I interviewed a midwife for the book who, as her children were at different stages of development, she could scale down her business, and then as they got older and she could take on more clients, she could scale it back up. And they actually don't pay medical malpractice insurance, at least because they're not practicing medicine. And so their what would you say, their income is actually very good for a fairly simple, no, again, it's a very important job and there's a lot at stake, but it's a profession that's a very viable profession for a lot of people that can be home-based.
Other questions?
For example, these are not all trades either in the sense of being blue-collar work, as we call it today. There are jewelers, there are professors. Actually, teaching shows up 3 times in this list. This list of trades comes from anything that was pre-industrial. In other words, about the late 18th century that's still around today. So you have school teachers, professors are in there, tutors, which is more informal education, but then they're also ranked. In other words, not all professions are equally family-centered. And the way that the book is written is that it's ranked, but the most family-centered is at the top. But there's a lot of breadth to the kind of vocations that have been out there that are historically stable.
So I was just wondering, we've been talking a lot about family-centered trades and family-centered jobs. But in our modern world where we do have the internet and all of these crazy devices that do crazy things that I don't understand, would you say that there still is a need for people to be in those professions? Or are you calling for almost like a recession back to like a pre-industrial time?
So these are all the trades that have survived to present and can still provide a living wage. So things like, and I'm just presenting these as options. You wouldn't have to do these options. There are many different ways that you could have a family-friendly vocation that wouldn't be included in this book necessarily, and that could still be considered a family economy. That the goal is that you're doing it together rather than separately. These professions in this book are historical in the sense that they survived the worst that history had to throw at them, and they're still right there today. Carpentry, well, let's say plasterer. So here's a job. that goes back to the 1790 and before. Someone who basically covers walls, coats walls with things like that. You might a modern counterpart would be like someone who does drywall. There are plasterers in our county that are charging like $150 an hour because it's so in demand, because there's just still so many millions of homes that need repair work. And these people work from home. They work oftentimes with their families. They have a very simple business model, but it's completely viable. And in fact, it makes a lot more money than I ever did as a computer programmer, which is more fitting in a modern economy. So a lot of our mindset of what is a viable vocation, when you actually get out there and test it, they're not as obsolete as they seem. And they actually outlast a lot of the more modern specialty trades that we come up with, daily. Like I mentioned, search engine optimizer. So back in 1790, kind of like the starting point for this research, there were about 70 distinct occupations. Today, there's well over 30,000. But of those 70 distinct occupations, 61 of them are still around. Whereas the tens of thousands of new vocations that came online through the revolutions, a lot of them have gone obsolete before that. So I guess, does that help answer your question a little bit? I'm not arguing for a pre-industrial life, but I am arguing for the relational integrity that came when families and communities depended on each other rather than on supermarkets and Walmart and things like that to get everything they need. Or Amazon, relying on this distributed, screen-based, abstracted world where you don't know who's making the parts that you're consuming. We used to have more relational depth. That, I would argue, absolutely. We should strive for that. It doesn't mean you have to turn the lights off to do that. But it does take intention, because the way that the modern world is so fragmented, it's always pulling relationships apart in order to improve efficiency.
So thank you. Do you have any advice for people who maybe aren't getting a business degree, on how you navigated through maybe what people might think, well, I want to paint houses, but I don't really know how to start a business and do the accounting and the taxes. What kind of resources do you point people to kind of get over that hump?
That's a great question. Because I've had a lot of people write in and say, here's my situation, what should I do? And I can only explain what happened in our case. I already had some background in this because I had been an entrepreneur and had started some companies. So in our case, it was a process. It took me about 5 years. I actually shut my computer business down back in April of this year. So after 22 years in software, it's done now. We're full-time focused on writing, teaching, and farming now. For other people, it's a very different prospect. And there are a lot of resources out there if you do want to get started, if you don't have a business background. I would always encourage people, well, number one, to pray. Because if you feel something that's on your heart, if there's a seed that's planted there, it's most likely God who put it there. And He has a path for you that no one else necessarily will be able to explain, but He'll guide you. So number one, pray. Number two, find a mentor. Go, if you want to get into Airbnb or if you want to get into woodworking, number one thing I recommend is that find someone who's accomplished in the area that you want to work in, and then go to work for them. Learn a trade. I actually went, when I was studying researching this book, I went to work for a butcher shop in town because I wanted to learn how to butcher animals. We raised animals, I just didn't know how to butcher chickens and I didn't know how any of this stuff worked. And so I went for about 3 months part-time, and I worked there. And I learned a lot. And by the way, whoa, that's quite an experience. They have a it's called a kill room, is what it's called. And you haven't cleaned anything until you've cleaned a kill room at the end of the day. But it's a messy job. But look, I learned a lot. I learned the pros. I learned the cons of working in that field. It's a very lucrative profession right now, as it turns out. Those who can own those things. So find mentors. There are people you can find in your community that will know how to mentor you into, including the business as well as the practice of a trade. It's a great question. Yeah.
So I'm wondering if there's, oh, thanks. I'm wondering if there's kind of a tension in some of what you're saying here, though it may just be my own ignorance. So if you had asked me before attending this talk, you know, let's say I wanted to give up the professorial life and be at home as many hours as I could while still paying the mortgage, you know. I would have said the obvious thing to do was some kind of computer-centered tech job, right? So I take it merely being physically present in the home doesn't in your argument cut the mustard. Is that right? It has to be more than that somehow.
That's correct.
Okay.
I mean, I can't give you an outline exactly what's right for each family. But what I can tell you is I worked from home for many years. And there was a clear delineation where I could not bring my family into the work. You know, my mission as a programmer, or as a software business owner, was so much of my life, right? I mean, you're so invested into this direction. So to not be able to have my family access that part of my life was still too much separation. It was wonderful. I mean, I much would prefer to work at home with a computer job than to work outside the home with a computer job. And it could be a segue into something that is more, you know, maybe part-time, you do it, and then you move into more full-time family. But it wasn't until we could align ourselves. See, God brings us together as families, right? What God has joined together, let not man put asunder. There are things in your family, in your marriage, in your children's lives that are unique to your family. And just like God gave you giftings to pursue things in your own life, he brought together the family unit. And that's the mindset that you have to have when you're going into this. And it's a major mental paradigm shift, is the individualism versus the familial approach to the economy. But here's just one example of how much we've changed. When the coal mines were first getting going, well, not first getting going, but when they started recruiting men off the farms to work in coal mines back in the late 1700s, early 1800s, the entire families would move to the coal mine and set up camp and live there on site if dad was working at the coal mine. Because at that time, it was so unthinkable that the family would be separate from the father. The family was always a cohesive unit. And so it took a while before they started to permit this breakdown of work and family being separated. So anyway, but what I'm saying is that they had the relational depth because of that we don't have today. Great questions.
I think we're pretty much out of time, so if you have another question for Mr. Groves, please feel free to step outside in the lobby area and talk to him privately. And please help me thank him for his presentation as well.